You're welcome to the program. You're watching Arise News now in Abuja. Ahead of over 60, next 60 minutes, all the global headlines you need to know about. I'm Rotimi Michael Kelly, and you're watching Arise News Hour. Our top stories. At least 10 reported dead as protests in Iran turned violent. The government says strong actions will be taken against those that defile the law. Well, plus, North Korea's leader insists there's no going back on the nuclear and ballistic missile program. And we will eat what we grow. Nigeria's president says rice importation will end by next year in his first speech ushering in the new year. And look who is back. Mariah Carey returns in style as she walks back into the New Year's Eve events like she's never been away. At least 10 people have been killed in the anti-government protest sweeping Iran, and the most dramatic unrest since the 2009 Green Movement, which was brutally suppressed by the regime. Iran's top judges called for a crackdown on the demonstrators after armed protesters attempted to take over police stations and military barracks. Up to 400 have been arrested so far, and many social media channels have been suspended. Arise News correspondent Laurie Lee joins us from our London studios in London with the latest. Laurie, hi. Yeah, good evening.
Good evening,
in a nationwide address by President Hassan Rouhani, he says, and I quote, "Our nation will deal with the minority who chant slogans against the law and people's wishes," end of quote. Don't you think this actually negates his earlier comment about free speech and free demonstration?
It's difficult. You bring up a very good point. Rouhani's comments are very difficult to interpret. The state news agency has reported that earlier today he spoke to some parliamentarians and said, "This is nothing. Iran has dealt with these sorts of protests before, and we will deal with them again." But I think these seemingly contradictory comments simply show what a difficult situation Hassan Rouhani is in. He's being pushed by his hardliners on the right to a certain extent. He's got a popular uprising on the other side, and he's really a man caught between a rock and a hard place. Now remember, he was re-elected in May in a landslide, and he ran on a pro-reform agenda. And he has started to enact some of those reforms, but unfortunately sometimes when you reform an economy, it hurts before it gets better. He's done things like removing subsidies from fuel and food. It's made those products so much more expensive, and that's been the spark that got these protests started at the middle of last week. But on the other hand, he also has to appease the very conservative clerical establishment, and he's really trying to balance those two factions.
Well, food prices are soaring, unemployment rising. Is this going to be more or less like a repeat of the 2009 Green Movement?
That's the question that everyone is asking. Certainly the profile of these demonstrations is very different than it was in 2009. The protests in 2009 were concentrated in Tehran, and it was very much an elite protest. The people who were out on the streets in 2009 tended to be middle class, they tended to be well educated, and in fact the pattern of the protests in 2009 was very interesting. The protests would peter out during the day when people were at work, and then really flare up in the evening when people left their jobs and took again to the streets. Now, the protests that started to flare last week are coming from a different socioeconomic strata. It's coming from the poorest in Iranian society, the people who have been hit so very hard by these removal of subsidies and subsequent increase in the cost of staple products. So the profile is very different. Certainly right now we're seeing fewer people out on the streets than we did in 2009, but it is definitely feeling like the authorities have lost control of this a little bit. No one seemed to see these protests coming. Last week when these protests got off the ground, a lot of people were speculating that they had been fomented, instigated by some of the right-wing opponents of Hassan Rouhani. But even so, even if that is the case, these protests have come out of their control. And there are some analysts saying that because the protesters are of a different demographic group, because these are the poorest of Iranian society, that these may be people who feel that they don't have a whole lot to lose. Where the middle class protest of 2009, people felt like, gosh, if I take this too far, I may lose my job, I may lose my standing in society. So it makes it difficult to forecast where these protests go, because it's not entirely like what we saw in 2009.
Laurie, how would you, or let me just say this, how would the clamping down on the opposition help the human rights record of Iran moving forward?
Well, the clampdown is not quite what we saw in 2009. 12 dead, and that's a tragedy, but we're not seeing the number of casualties that would suggest that the authorities are clamping down. About 400 arrests, half of those are more or less in Tehran. But the feeling is that if these protests continue to spread, that the authorities are going to have to take a much harder line. The interesting thing about these protests is that they're not particularly well led. They're scattered. The opponents of the government are not coalescing around a single opponent or a single figure to oppose the government. It's more scattered protests. So they're not centralized in any way. The feeling is, though, that if we see a crackdown, and the betting is that within a couple of days we will see a more forceful crackdown than we have seen. But the betting is that Rouhani, we spoke about the difficult position he's in a few moments ago, Rouhani will have to offer some kind of a carrot as well as the stick of a crackdown. What that carrot could be is difficult to guess. It would certainly be something in the economic realm, but as you and I were saying earlier, when you offer economic reforms, sometimes the pain on the populace comes before the gain. So it's not entirely clear what Hassan Rouhani could offer as a carrot to go along with any stick in the form of a more brutal crackdown.
Thank you very much, Laurie Laird. Thank you. We appreciate your thought. Our correspondent there, Laurie Laird. And in other news, North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un says a nuclear launch button is, and I quote, always on my table, warning the U.S. it will never be able to start a war. In a televised news speech, he said that the entire U.S. was within range of North Korean nuclear weapons, adding that this is reality and not a threat. But he also offered a potential olive branch to South Korea, suggesting it was open to dialogue. Kim also said North Korea may also send a team to the Winter Olympics in Seoul. A speedboat carrying 51 people capsized off Indonesia's part of Borneo Island on Monday, killing at least 8. The accident happened when the boat called the Anugerah Express was traveling from Tanjung Selo to Tarakan in the same province. A search and rescue official in Tarakan said that in addition to the deaths, several other people were believed to be missing. According to the boat's manifest, the boat was carrying 48 passengers, including 5 children and 3 crew members. The official said, adding that infants were usually not listed in the manifest. You're watching the Rise News Hour. Plenty more still ahead, including Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari, senior specialist assistant